Good afternoon, everyone. Hello to my team in Kansas. I will miss you guys. I hope you're having a great lunch at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. Hello, my name is Dawn Hammett, and I am the director of the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and the acting director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library. And it's been a while since I've done one of these, but I sure have missed you. So welcome here today. We're really excited that Juliet Morris has decided to speak with us today. Juliet is the education specialist at the Supreme Court Historical Society in Washington, D.C. And she joins us today virtually to take a closer look at the life and career of Chief Justice Earl Warren. He was appointed by President Eisenhower just before the landmark case of Brown v. Board. And as you know, we are in the midst of the anniversary of that decision right now. We just marked the 70th anniversary. We are so happy that Juliet is here with us. Thank you, Juliet. Please take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Juliet. I am the education specialist at the Supreme Court Historical Society in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about Earl Warren and his career and how it overlaps a little bit with President Eisenhower. But first, I wanted to just speak for a minute about what the society is. If we could get that slide up on the screen. The Supreme Court Historical Society is a not-for-profit 501c3 membership organization dedicated to preserving and collecting the history of the Supreme Court of the United States, increasing public awareness of the court's contribution to our nation's rich constitutional heritage, and acquiring knowledge covering the history of the entire judicial branch. And we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary. Chief Justice Warren Burger founded the society 50 years ago. So we have a lot of other exciting events happening as we celebrate that. So please do check out our website if you'd like to participate in any of those. We can go ahead and move to the next slide so we can start the presentation. So as was mentioned earlier, May 17th marked the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. The decision, which was handed down in 1954, declared public school segregation unconstitutional and led to wider civil rights victories in the 1960s. It largely overturned the court's 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which legalized segregation and became the basis of Jim Crow laws. Brown was originally argued in 1952 under Chief Justice Fred Vinson. The court could not establish a majority, and it decided to rehear the case in December of 1953. Chief Justice Vinson would not live to rehear the case, as he died suddenly in September of 1953. It would be up to a new Chief Justice, appointed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, to hear the case with his 8 co-equal brethren. Eisenhower nominated Earl Warren, the governor of California. We will never know what would have happened if Vinson had lived to hear Brown. What we do know is that Warren's leadership united the court, which was previously divided over the case, to reach a unanimous decision. After Brown, the court under Chief Justice Warren would continue to recognize and protect individual rights and freedoms. It would continue to protect the rights and dignity of ordinary people. Earl Warren was born on March 19, 1891 in Los Angeles, California. His parents, Matthias and Crystal, both immigrated to the Midwestern United States from Scandinavia as infants and were extremely poor. The couple had 2 children, Earl and a daughter, Ethel. Shortly before Warren turned 5 years old, the family moved north to a small townhouse in Bakersfield, California, where Matthias worked as a car repairman on the Southern Pacific Railroad. At the time, both Los Angeles and Bakersfield were small but growing railroad towns. Warren recalled that in his neighborhood, there were no organized social or recreational activities for either school children or adults. There was no theater, nor for some years even a library. It was just a dusty frontier railroad town. Matthias, who was never able to get his own education, strongly supported his son's schooling. When Warren was 5 years old, Matthias persuaded the principal to let him start first grade a year early. Warren exceeded expectations and skipped to the 3rd grade at the end of the year. He was one of the few students from his grammar school to move on to high school. Most went straight to work, typically on the railroad. But he started high school when he was 12 years old, the youngest and smallest boy in the school. Outside of school, Warren played clarinet in the town band and spent time with his many pets. His favorite was his burro, Jack, whom he described as his closest companion. I searched far and wide for a picture of Jack the burro, and unfortunately, all I could find was Earl Warren with his dog, which is still objectively adorable. Starting at age 9, he held various summer jobs, including working on grocery wagons, bookkeeping, and a newspaper delivery route. From age 15 through law school, he worked seasonally in different departments of the Southern Pacific Railroad. His father encouraged him to save every dollar he earned and always assumed the responsibility of providing for the family. This included funding Warren's college education. In 1908, Warren started at the University of California at Berkeley. He stayed in Berkeley to study at the university's new law school and graduated with his law degree in 1914. After law school, Warren worked for an oil company and a law firm. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, he enlisted in the Army. The Army never deployed him overseas and discharged him a year later. So in 1918, Warren got a job as a legislative aide and worked his way up through the local government. In 1920, he was promoted to be a deputy on the Alameda County, California District Attorney's staff. 5 years later, he was appointed to be the district attorney. For 13 years, he fought against corruption and violent crime, establishing a reputation as a tough and effective prosecutor. During this time, Warren met his wife, Nina Palmquist Myers. Her family, like Warren's, had immigrated from Scandinavia and settled in California. The couple married on October 14, 1925, and together had 6 children. After a successful tenure at the county level, Warren received a nomination for Attorney General of California in 1938. He held this position for 4 years. While he was in this role, the Japanese military attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. At the time, U.S. military intelligence reported that fishing boats off the West Coast, many of which were operated by Japanese workers, were sending signals to enemy submarines. As Attorney General, Earl testified in support of a proposal to require people of Japanese descent to move from the West Coast. In practice, about 122,000 people of Japanese descent, including 70,000 American citizens, were forcibly moved to 10, quote, relocation centers, where they were incarcerated until the war's end. Warren reflected on this in his 1977 memoir, and he wrote that I have since deeply regretted the removal order and my own testimony advocating it, because it was not in keeping with our American concept of freedom and the rights of citizens. Warren was then elected governor of California in 1942. As governor, he passed legislation that funded improvements for the state's hospital system, prison system, a highway program, and old age and unemployment benefits. He won re-election an unprecedented 3 times. He leveraged this success in 2 presidential campaigns. In 1948, he became the Republican nominee for vice president. He and his running mate, Thomas Dewey, lost to Harry Truman. 4 years later, Warren's 1952 presidential campaign ended when General Dwight D. Eisenhower won the Republican Party nomination. Afterward, Warren worked on the Eisenhower campaign. When Eisenhower won the presidency, Warren went back to his regular duties as governor of California. The president then called him early in December of 1952, promising him the next Supreme Court vacancy. At first, Warren didn't really think anything of this. He recalled having, quote, often heard of newly elected officials who promised positions in the indefinite future, only to forget when the jobs actually became open for appointment. So he wasn't expecting much. But then, on September 8, 1953, Chief Justice Fred Vinson suddenly died. Eisenhower nominated Warren to fill the position. He thought Warren would make a good Chief Justice because he was politically moderate, was known for his integrity, and demonstrated strong managerial skills as governor. Warren began later that month as interim Chief Justice, and the Senate officially confirmed his nomination on March 1st, 1954. Warren's nomination came on the eve of Brown versus Board of Education. Brown is the case that ended school segregation and overturned Plessy v. Ferguson's 1896 separate but equal precedent. In this case, the court found that school segregation was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The court originally heard the case in the fall of 1952 when Vinson was Chief Justice, but after the initial argument, the court was badly split, and the justices ultimately decided to delay the case. They scheduled a rehearing for December of 1953, shortly after Warren became Vinson's successor. Given the sensitivity and controversial nature of school segregation, Warren believed that it was important for the court to achieve a unanimous vote in Brown. He held several private and informal conversations with his fellow justices to discuss the case. Justice Stanley F. Reed of Kentucky, for example, was reluctant to join the majority, so Warren went to him. He said, "Stan, you're all by yourself in this now. You've got to decide whether it's really the best thing for the country." On May 17, 1954, the court unanimously held that the separate but equal doctrine adopted in Plessy v. Ferguson has no place in the field of public education. The Brown decision was the turning point in the country's struggle for equal protection under the law for all citizens, with particular application to education. It also gave encouragement to the civil rights movement. Brown's impact on segregation, however, was not immediate. State resistance perpetuated school segregation. After the court followed up with Brown in 1955, which is what we call Brown 2, by instructing states to implement school desegregation with, quote, all deliberate speed, some southern states refused to comply. They used pupil placement laws, provided state-sponsored tuition for private schools, created white citizens' councils, and denied state funds to desegregated schools as methods of what's called massive resistance. In Mississippi and Louisiana, attending a desegregated school actually became a criminal act. Some school districts closed desegregated schools altogether. The most famous example of this is Prince Edward County Public Schools in Virginia, which closed for 5 years. And there's a picture from a protest of that pictured on the screen. One example of this state resistance happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. In September 1957, a group of Black students, now known as the Little Rock Nine, endured a week of unsuccessful attempts to go to class at Central High School. First, the Arkansas governor ordered the National Guard to block their entrance. Then, mobs threatened their safety. Finally, the head of the NAACP stated that the 9 children would not return until they had the protection of the president. Now, in the realm of civil rights, President Eisenhower believed in leading by example, stating, quote, "I do not believe we can cure all the evils in men's heart by law." He took action on the federal level, hoping that the states would follow. During his first 8 months in office, he desegregated restaurants in Washington, D.C., challenged segregation practices in schools on military bases, and created the Committee on Government Contracts to oversee fair hiring practices in the allocation of federal contracts. He was, however, conflicted about how swiftly Brown could be implemented. He stated, quote, "These people in the South were not breaking the law for the last 60 years. Now we cannot erase the emotions of 3 generations just overnight." With enough time to adjust, he believed, segregated states would comply with the court's ruling in Brown. Therefore, it was with great thought that, in an unprecedented move, Eisenhower authorized the deployment of federal troops to Little Rock on September 23, 1957. The National Guard accompanied students into Central High on Wednesday, a week and a half after the first day of school, and more than 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Even if a state technically complied with Brown, residential housing patterns across the country meant that many neighborhoods were racially segregated. Children are typically assigned to a neighborhood school, so in many instances, that decision had little impact on school demographics. In some ways, the struggle continues today. A report from the U.S. Government Accountability Office found that over 1/3 of students in the 2020-2021 school year attended a school where over 75% of students were of a single ethnicity, showing that de facto segregation still exists. While there was a delay between Brown and the civil rights action it demanded, the decision marked a new era for the court. Brown was the first of several cases decided under Chief Justice Warren that became landmarks in protecting individual rights and freedoms. Loving versus Virginia in 1967 declared laws prohibiting interracial marriage unconstitutional. Matt v. Ohio in 1961, Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963, and Miranda v. Arizona in 1966 protected the rights of the accused. In Baker v. Carr in 1962, the court decided it had jurisdiction to review state redistricting plans, which indirectly allowed it to protect voting rights. These cases, along with Brown, all followed a trend of recognizing and protecting the rights of ordinary people. Warren retired from the court in 1969. In his retirement, he enjoyed his favorite hobbies: hunting, fishing, and traveling. He traveled around the world with his wife, Nina, speaking at college campuses in the United States and attending international conferences. He suffered a fatal heart attack on July 9, 1974, and died at age 83. During his 16 years as Chief Justice, the court issued decisions that advocated for changes in the nation's approach to school desegregation, civil rights, and due process. Warren was remembered by Justice William Brennan with this tribute. People were his concern, especially ordinary people, the disadvantaged, the downtrodden, the poor, the friendless. He strongly believed that individual human dignity was the primary value fostered and protected by the Constitution. Warren and Nina, who lived until 1993, were both buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and he received an Army honor funeral recognizing his service in World War I. And I thank you for listening. And I believe I'll turn it over to Dawn now to moderate the questions.
Well, thank you, Juliet. That was really amazing. And it was, frankly, I was really surprised to hear about Warren's involvement in the internment of the Japanese Americans. That was rather shocking. And it was nice to hear that eventually he decided that that was the wrong decision that he made. So we have, in the Eisenhower family, we have one of Eisenhower's brothers who was on that federal agency that was involved in planning and the movement of those people. And he denied to do that, and he quit the commission.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, we think so too.
Yeah, when in Warren's memoir, he spends a fair amount of time talking about his involvement in that. And what he really emphasizes is the context surrounding the time. And he paints a really clear picture in his writing of how, like, charged the atmosphere was. You can almost imagine, maybe an apt comparison might be 9/11 and how charged the atmosphere was here towards people of Middle Eastern descent after that happened, and how, you look back now and realize that there was a lot of stuff that was done in strong reaction to that in the name of what we thought was national security. That really was not okay at all. So he really illustrates a lot of examples of the different things that made him feel that way when he gave that testimony, and then looks back and says, no, this was not in line with our constitutional values at all.
That was really interesting. And on a separate note, I grew up in Louisiana, and my school system was segregated by gender. Following the desegregation case. So I went to public schools with all girls.
That was the state law to segregate by gender?
No, it was just my parish. Well, my parish and another parish.
Gotcha.
That was not state law.
Yeah.
All right. Well, right now I'd like to tell our in-person guests in Kansas, if you have a question, you can write it out on the notepad that you have in front of you or on the table. I'm not sure who's in the room with you, but one of the staff members will take the question from you, type it for me to read on this side of the camera, and we're really looking forward to that. As we're getting ready for questions, Juliet, I did have one or two maybe. Can you tell us more about their professional relationship, President Eisenhower and Chief Justice Warren? Can you tell us about their professional relationship? Was it mutually respectful? Was President Eisenhower happy or satisfied with the outcomes and the rulings of the court?
That's a great question, and it's a bit of a complicated one because some of the things that are written that Eisenhower has said about Warren are not substantiated. So, as a matter of fact, there's some things out there that would indicate that Eisenhower was not satisfied with the Warren court at all. He nominated him to the court thinking that he was of the same political mind as himself, and Earl Warren's decisions turned out to be a lot more on the left end of the spectrum than what Eisenhower had hoped for, because of course justices are nonpartisan figures and they follow, each case as they see fit, contrary to what perhaps the appointing president might want. So as Earl Warren went through his chief justiceship and was, expanding rights, or rather recognizing and protecting rights of the accused and expanding school desegregation in different ways, Eisenhower was really, he had some reservations about that. The most famous quote, that's perhaps a misquote, we don't know if he actually said it or not, Eisenhower may have written or said to somebody that his biggest mistake was nominating Earl Warren and Justice William Brennan to the bench. We don't know if he said that or not, but it's often reported in the books that he did. I think the fact that it exists perhaps gives us a sense that it wasn't all warm and fuzzy there. There was some tension. In his memoir, actually, Earl Warren writes that he knows that Eisenhower was upset with him. So we don't know if Eisenhower said that, but we know through Warren's own writings that there was tension between them because of the way that the court decided.
Thank you. We need to get the archivists out there to start looking for an image of that borough, huh?
Please. Oh, and yeah, that story unfortunately doesn't have a happy ending because he was like, this borough was his buddy. They were best friends. But then young entrepreneur that Earl Warren was, a local shoe company reached out to him and asked if they could buy Jack from Earl Warren because they wanted to use him to advertise for their company. Like they wanted to put a board sign over him. So he sold the borough to them and they said, you can come visit him whenever you want. And he said, I was devastated to sell my borough, but I wanted the money. I don't know. But here's the thing. They had so much trouble at the shoe company taking care of this borough because anytime they would try to go out and advertise with him, he would run away back to the Warrens' ranch. And then one day, little Earl went over to visit his borough and was told that the borough had died. And it was suspicious.
Oh, that's not a great marketing mechanism either.
No.
That's terrible.
That's a fun little gem that you might not know about one of our Chief Justices.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. We're hoping to get, as they're getting some more, I'll read these. Was there an impact on the credibility of the court when Plessy was overturned?
I think that it's safe to say that, each individual had their own opinion about that. I certainly perhaps concentrated in the southern region where they were not really welcoming that opinion. Looking at something like Brown versus Board of Education, you look at the sentiment of Dwight Eisenhower as an example. He says, well, where did this unconstitutionality come from? Because this was constitutional up until now. And now these unelected officials are saying that it's not, and I'm breaking the law. So there was a lot of resistance to the court in that way. And that's what I was saying about the idea of massive resistance, and that the states were not respecting the court's decision there. They think, well, this doesn't have any authority, right? These people, they're just deciding this, right? I didn't vote for this person. So definitely there was an impact on how people were viewing the court after Brown came out and Plessy was overturned.
That's interesting. I guess I never thought about it from that point of view. That's really interesting. We have another comment from Matthew. Great job. Is there any evidence that Warren's regrets with his internment camp decision affected his decisions on desegregation?
That's an interesting question. And I'm not sure because, he wrote his memoir in 1977 and Brown was in 1954. And at that point, we're only 10 years removed from when Pearl Harbor happened. So I don't know if at that point he was feeling differently about the decision. But, I think given that that's the choice that he made and he felt so strongly about it that he wanted to have a unanimous opinion, he probably was thinking differently about the Constitution at that point and what it means for everybody. So we don't know if that's what he thought at that time, but you can speculate that maybe, at that time he was starting to think differently about the Constitution and how that would have applied to his decision 10 years prior.
What are some of his other landmark cases? What else did the court deal with during his tenure?
So one of the main things was rights of the accused. So those landmark cases would be Miranda versus Arizona, where that's what established you need to have your Miranda rights read to you in order for that evidence to be admissible in court. Gideon versus Wainwright and Mapp versus Ohio, which require you to have counsel present and protect search and seizure rights. And then I've got my handy dandy board behind me here. This is all the stuff that I have to write about on our website. Two other ones I'll mention. First of all, Griswold versus Connecticut was the first case that linked a right to privacy to reproduction. So that case sort of was a predecessor to Roe v. Wade. And New York Times versus Sullivan was a major win for freedom of the press, because that case changed the way that we look at libel. And that case is interesting because it is sort of an overlap of free press and civil rights, because the newspaper article in question that may have been libelous was an advertisement trying to raise money to defend Martin Luther King Jr. in court.
So that led me to just sort of a general Supreme Court history question. In the arc of the life of the whole Supreme Court, have there been times of great dynamic decisions? And are they waves, or is it like a steady? How's it work in the history of the Supreme Court?
Can you explain what you mean by waves?
Well, is it like waves of lots of big momentous decisions? They sort of come in waves and then there's a lull, or do they all change our society? I'm sorry.
I mean, all the decisions change our society in small ways. It just depends, what's relevant to you.
Good point.
So for example, the court today released 2 new decisions. But, maybe you haven't seen headlines about them because the media doesn't find those issues to be as pressing as other ones might be. So Earl Warren is unique because he was Chief Justice at a time where there was so much happening in the country in terms of the civil rights movement. A lot of his cases are related to that. Same with, women's rights as well there.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
We have a question from Brian. How well did Warren work with his fellow judges? How did he decide who would write the decisions?
So it's pretty, unanimous amongst everything I've read about his justices that they all said that he was a really great manager and very fairly distributed the decisions to everybody. People like his fellow justices, William Brennan is mostly who I've read about, really complimented the way that he would run conference and make sure that everybody, had an equal weight of cases that they were looking at. So to answer the question, how did he decide who would write the decisions? I think that it was very much he was trying to make sure that everything was balanced.
All right, thank you. Samantha keeps putting up the Supreme Court Historical Society's timeline. So this is available on your website?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is our new civics education website. The audience here is for teachers and students. And the idea is that every year we're launching a new historical era. So right now on the website is the Marshall Court era. And currently I am writing and researching everything for the Warren Court era, which will launch in November. And you can see behind me my outline here of everything that will be up on the website, including different case summaries and resources like looking at Brown from as the beginning of the movement as opposed to the end of school segregation, and life stories about different justices and advocates.
It's amazing. So it's civics.supremecourthistory.org. Thank you, Samantha. We have a question. Ike enforced Brown v. Board. Have any presidents refused to enforce a SCOTUS decision?
That's a great question. Not to my knowledge, and the Historical Society only examines work up until the current sitting justice, so I can't speak to anything past when Clarence Thomas is serving. But not to my knowledge, I don't know of any president who refused to enforce a SCOTUS decision.
Okay, I have another question. Looking back at the Warren Court, one might conclude it was a progressive court in retrospect. How did Warren's thinking evolve over the course of his Supreme Court service?
That's an interesting question because his first case was Brown v. Board, which a lot of people would say is a very progressive case. The idea that the federal government could enforce something like school desegregation across all of the states was a pretty revolutionary idea, and in the context of the time was a very drastic step, more so than what we realize even just going back and studying it. And I think that thinking really sort of was steady throughout all of his term.
Okay. One of the questions I had was, you mentioned that he was promised a position on the Supreme Court. Was it because he worked on the campaign, or were there other reasons to have been promised that position?
It was largely because of his connection to Eisenhower on the campaign. Yeah.
Okay. And then we had one big question that I felt like I should leave a little later. How do you see AI affecting history?
I love that question and I hate that question. I
left it.
I was a high school teacher for 8 years. So it is going to change certainly how we teach history, because I can say as an educator, even in the last year and a half when it really picked up, it was changing, because I'm, reading what the kids are writing, and they didn't write it. It's coming from a bot. So I think what will be changing in terms of teaching history, and we've already been moving in this direction, is we're going to be focusing a lot on the skills of history, and we're going to be focusing on big themes and understanding how to put these different pieces and facts together that the oracle of the internet can provide for us.
So rather than just a recitation of the facts.
Right. Because no longer do you need to be able to recite the Civil War was from blah, 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 blah. You can Google that and it will come up right away. Right. What you need to understand is, what were some of the major themes? How did attitudes from the North change over time? That's not something that AI can come up for you as easily. It can, but we need to be teaching people how to think that way.
All right, we have another question. How do you compare the Supreme Court today with the Warren Court?
So as I said, we don't address the court presently. We focus on the history of the court. So I can't speak to anything that's past Clarence Thomas's appointment, unfortunately.
Well, that was really the whole backstory of Warren was really interesting. We got another question while I was talking. What was the reasoning for putting Warren in charge of the JFK assassination investigation? How does that tie into his experience on the Supreme Court?
I don't remember off the top of my head why Johnson wanted Warren to be in charge of that, but I know that Warren did not want to be in charge of it. He writes in his memoir about how he said no several times, and Johnson sort of appealed to his patriotic inside and was like, when you were a soldier in the Army, you did what your commanding officer told you to do, and I'm your commanding officer, and I'm telling you I need you to serve the country in this way, and you're going to make a big difference by doing this, more so than you could have in the Army. And then he agreed to do it. I think overall, though, and I don't know as much about this topic, but my understanding is that it didn't tie in so much into his experience on the same Supreme Court as much as it just existed alongside of it, if that makes sense.
You mentioned his his military service during World War I. Do you know more about what he did during the war?
Well, he was never deployed. So I don't know exactly where he was stationed or anything, or where he went to training.
Well, Eisenhower wasn't deployed either, so there was a few of them that stayed stateside. So I'm waiting to see if we have some more questions from our audience online or in the room. And otherwise, is there any, as we wait, are there any sort of other family stories you could share with us from him as a child?
That's a great question. I'd say not from him as a child necessarily, but something I think that's important about him is that his family as an adult, his wife Nina and his 6 children, were really central to who he was as a person. The media sometimes called them the unbeatable family. I don't know if that was supposed to be sort of similar to the Camelot vision or not, but he spent a great deal of time prioritizing his family. If you read about things that his kids wrote, they say, when we were growing up, we never felt like we were living in the spotlight. We felt like our dad, he worked a lot, but he paid attention to us, and the time that we spent together as a family was always treasured and important. So those, I think, core, that the family really centered him, and I think was a key driver for him in everything that he did.
I am checking for questions as we are talking, making sure that everything is put in. Oh, we have another one. Since Justice Marshall argued before Warren and was then appointed to the court, did that impact their relationship?
Yeah, so Thurgood Marshall was an advocate with the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund before he was appointed to the Supreme Court. As far as I know, it didn't impact their relationship in any negative way at all. I would imagine that it only would have been positive.
Fantastic. Well, I don't see any more. Every time I say I don't see any more questions, one pops up. That must be like the juju. Brian has a question. Besides his memoirs, what other biographies would you recommend to learn more about Warren? That's a great question, Brian.
That is a great question. And I've got my bookshelf over here. For a couple of things in the Warren Court era that I found very interesting and beneficial. So first is the memoirs of Earl Warren. It's a really candid writing that he's done. It's interesting, gives you a lot of insight into him. You can learn more about Jack the Burro. I also would recommend from Lucas Powell, The Warren Court and American Politics, which is a pretty thorough analysis of all of, everything from his appointment until the end. And then for a specific case, for New York Times versus Sullivan, which is the case that handled and sort of redefined what libelous speech is, this book, Actual Malice by Samantha Barbas, does a great job at diving into that case specifically. So I hope that perhaps gives you some reading to look into.
That's amazing. Do you get to use the Supreme Court archives as well?
Yeah, I have online access to the archives.
So,
and I work with our with the court curator, and he's actually in the process right now of pulling up different photos for me from the Warren era for us to use on our website.
Nice. So that we're part of the National Archives and Records Administration, and so we always like to encourage people to use archives as a primary resources when they can.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm right across the street from the Library of Congress as well.
Oh, I'd forgotten about that proximity. All right, well, I'm going to ask it again, which means the question's going to pop in. I don't see any other questions coming in. So Samantha, should we move on to our thank yous? That's a yes. I love that Samantha's driving all of this behind us. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our public program. Our 2024 public programs are made possible through the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeffcoat Memorial Foundation. Without these funders and these supporters, we would not be able to do these programs. Juliet, thank you so much for talking to us today. I know everybody really enjoyed this. So our next Lunch and Learn program is Okay, Let's Go. It's July 25th, noon Central in the library courtyard, and we will stream it live. And our own Dr. James Ginther will be with us. He's our supervisory archivist. And those of you who watched him on CBS Sunday Morning News recently should recognize what he's going to be talking about. He's going to talk to us about him doing that program for us and some of the background conversations that he had that maybe didn't make it to air. And available on Monday, we have all of our lectures and panel discussions from the Civil Rights Conference. The Civil Rights Conference is happening right now. We are working with the National Park Service, the Clinton Library, the Clinton Foundation, the Eisenhower Foundation, Brown v. Board's site. There's the Central High School site. There's a lot of us working together to bring this conference to everyone this week. And on Monday on our YouTube channel, you will be able to view the programs that happen this week. And if you're not part of our email list, I recommend you do that. You can go to our website. There's a little blue button that says join our email list. If you click on that, you can input your email data. We will send out emails to you. All of the information about all of our programming will be in those emails. And finally, thank you so very much. I'm so sorry that I didn't get to be in the courtyard with our friends in Kansas, but my goodness, Juliet, what a wonderful program. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.
Delighted. Bye, everybody.